Good evening. My name is Dave Corsi, and this is the Liberty Action Network. Tonight, our very special guest is Dr. Michael Zay. Dr. Zay wrote a book, Ageless Nation, which is a fascinating read about the prospects for long-term life, health. Dr. Zay, welcome.
Thank you for having me tonight.
Our pleasure. Tell us a little bit about your book.
The book basically, as the subtitle says, talks about the quest for superlongevity and physical perfection. I use the word perfection, human enhancement. It really talks about all of the trends, the medical trends, scientific trends that are enabling us to basically live much longer than we really expected to. It's always a surprise when we start to expand. And the new version of the book, which came out over the summer, talks about even some of the further developments. It's almost, the developments are happening so quickly, scientifically and technologically, that it almost makes one's head spin. It doesn't get as much press as it would, and people hear about these advancements sporadically, and basically what the book says, let's look at the totality of all of those advances, and let's look at the impact it's going to have on society, the economy, politics, the culture.
Okay, so it's almost a positive news story about what can happen within people's wellness or health. When you say add to their longevity, are we talking 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, what happened during the 20th century, and which was just an amazing century in terms of longevity, it's almost amazing to think that the average age for Americans, remember we're an advanced industrial society, 1900, the average age was about 47. That's what life expectancy was, the average life expectancy. It doesn't mean that people didn't live to 60, 70 years old. But to put it in context, when Social Security was first passed, one could collect at age 65. The average life expectancy was 63. So basically, advantage government, all right? Government, yes. They did the numbers and they said, on average, people will not live that long. Right. They, on average. A lot of breakthroughs took place during that period of time and really kind of took us by surprise, one of the biggest being the introduction of antibiotics. And I always like to remind my baby boomer friends who might have been born in the late 1940s or the 1950s, they were about 8 or 10 years away from, if they were born 8 or 10 years before that, some of the diseases that we just basically take a pill for could have been life-threatening, life-endangering. So those kinds of achievements really changed the life expectancy. So it occurred to the point that we were 47 in 1900, life expectancy was in the 70s by 2000. So we're adding, it's not quite 50% of a lifespan, but it is basically at least 1 or 2 more parts of the life cycle have been added, which is leading to some of the problems that we're having today because we never really prepared for it.
Right.
Not in the sense we could have.
Thinking Social Security, because if they had done their actuarial, said, okay, even if the average person goes 5 years into it and dies at the age of 70, now with that increasement, all of a sudden they need to come up with the money to pay for that, which is how we ended up in a pay-as-you-go type situation, I would assume, correct?
Yes, and in fact, for all practical purposes, it's being Social Security and all of that social safety net. When we looked at these unfunded mandates, and the key word is unfunded, could be as high as $122 trillion for the next 30 years. Our entire gross domestic product is only about 16, 17 trillion. So you can see, even if we turned over
8 years worth of the entire
economy. So obviously, that is going to be a problem. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I'm trying to prepare people for the idea that you're probably going to live longer than people remember living. It could go, the number of 100-year-olders is expanding so quickly that it's literally becoming, we don't talk about it as being that much of an achievement. Now we talk about the super centenarians, the ones who get to 110.
Right.
People think there's a stop limit to this, that at a certain point, 112, 114, for a lot of physical reasons, the body just can't continue beyond that. But we're not sure that's true. And a lot of the book, at least the early part of the book, looks at the breakthroughs that are taking place since around the year 2000, which including genetic engineering, genetic gene therapy, stem cell science, a lot of these, some of them very kind of arcane types of breakthroughs, which could extend us really not necessarily to infinity, but could potentially lead us to living 125. And because of the breakthroughs in human enhancement technologies, the use of HGH, human growth hormone, and the like, we could live those as relatively young people.
So, in effect, what you're saying when you mentioned 125 years, what popped into my head was literally the day you start collecting Social Security, you could be at the midway point, not getting into the twilight of your life, but literally just be at the midway point, which the impact has to be tremendous as far as financial, resources, and just everybody's whole idea of when to retire. And would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's an important point, because when you think about what I gave a talk at the World Future Society, which is actually a fascinating society. I'm a futurist by trade, a sociologist / futurist, and futurists meet once a year in these huge summits, the World Future Society. We met down in Orlando, and I gave a talk there about this issue, and basically the title was "Live Longer, Work Longer." I mean, basically they have to be intertwined. And I showed them a diagram, and I said, okay, if you think about people, their work life, basically between the ages of, say, 25 and 60, 25 and 62, and you think about that within the context of a life cycle where life expectancy where people live to 65. Okay, so we look at that, and people's work life takes up a broad part of their life.
Sure.
You extend that out to 80, and now that little part of that starts to shrink relative to the size. Then out to 125, you have this vast frontier of time that is expanding out there. And the issue is not just how it affects the individual, but how it affects the society. Because if you have the same little cohort, when I say little cohort, it becomes smaller and smaller relative to the rest of the population. You realize this is unsustainable. It literally cannot. It's not, those people work, even if every one of them was working full time, couldn't fund all of the dependents younger than they, and then all of the people much older. And in fact, I think that people are already getting the message, because when you look at all of these jobs that are supposedly being created month by month, most of those jobs, and here's the shocker, out of like 240,000 jobs that they claim are being created, about 230,000 of those are people 55 and older. It is not the 20-year-old or the 25 or 30. And you think about it, why is it? Well, most of those people are going into part-time jobs, retail jobs, etc. They've lost their jobs, their career, but they realize making individual choices, I can't live on whatever it is, I cannot afford to live. So they're crowding into these jobs. And you see there, it is really amazing to see that even though most age groups, their labor force participation has dwindled, that group from age 25 to 55, they've lost 2 million jobs. They have not gained jobs since 2009. They are losing the net number of jobs. But you look at that 55-year-old group, it's as though the recession didn't happen. It's just they're moving up and up and up in terms of their participation. So they're getting the message already. The question is, I don't think people are planning their lives for that eventuality in which they will get to 60, 65. They expect this magic, somehow this magic funding to somehow appear.
I'm also thinking from what you just said about in the public sector, you think about your policemen, your school teachers, a lot of them retire at the age of 55. And their pensions then would be from, say, 55 to 125. As you mentioned, that has to be totally unsustainable.
Oh, it is. It is. I mean, and most governors.
Is anybody addressing that or really thinking about that?
Well, they are addressing it to the extent that they are basically, well, I mean, when it comes to finance, the books always have to be balanced eventually.
Right.
We can say what we will, but the governors who are looking at the numbers will, for instance, Governor Christie at one point earlier in the year did not want to release whatever $2 billion that was going to pay for this. Under pressure, I guess a lot of money was moved into those funds, but the question is, where does that money come from? You're either going to borrow it or you're going to tax it. And when it comes to the states, I mean, if people feel overtaxed, as opposed to feeling overtaxed in the United States in general, you can leave the state. And people will do that, and they will make those individual decisions, which means that we can promise people what we want. We can write on paper what we believe should happen. But if the money is not there, what they will do is they will tinker, and then tinker drastically with the amount of money that people will get. They will cut their health care benefits. So the issue is
IRAs.
So the point I've been making is that it's going to take a concerted attitude change on the part of employers, government, business, and the individuals themselves to recognize that the life cycle, the work life cycle, is going to have to expand. People are going to have to work longer. But they should embrace that, because there are so many positives that, you know, that people have as they work in the workforce.
But society has gotten to this thing where I can't wait till I can retire. I hate my job. I can't wait till I retire. So that is pretty much going to be a tough sell for a lot of people, because they have that, I consider it a terrible attitude, but that's their attitude towards work. And ultimately, though, you're saying sooner or later the reality will have to hit them.
Yes, it will have to hit them. It will have to hit us as a society. So better to embrace that reality at age 25, 30, 35, prepare for second, third careers, not just part-time jobs that are going to help you get by at kind of a subsistence level of standard of living, and, you know, prepare for that next career, or at least have companies be realistic about it and say that, you know, we're going to keep people. There are instances of companies out there, and I hear about these companies where, you know, they hire people 55 and over, 60 and over, and a lot of the people there are, you know, the average age is much higher than a normal company would. Yeah, they have to pay these people extra because they have longevity in the job and in the organization. But the payback from having people with experience, wisdom, and knowledge is so important. But I think the problem that we have, and one of the reasons I wrote Ageless Nation, and it's something I see us encountering just in the society in general, and certainly politically, is that we seem to be, in some sense, saying that long life is not a good thing. I mean, I always took it that one of the reasons I wrote the book is that it wasn't just optimistic about the fact that we could live longer, but that there are advantages to doing this, and it's something that it's a trend we should be embracing, not fearing.
So you don't espouse we have an obligation to die theory that I remember former governor of Colorado used to talk about, or Rahm Emanuel's brother.
Yes, and it has been a firestorm, and one of the reasons, again, that I wrote the book, being a futurist, hopefully you can anticipate trends, and sure enough, it's happening. When I was writing the book in the last decade, 2006, 2007, the attitude was, how do we develop scientific techniques, technologies, pharmaceuticals that can extend life? That's what the question was. Suddenly, the question started to turn to, how do we pay for health care? I mean, the idea was medical breakthroughs, scientific breakthroughs were going to help us live longer. Now it becomes an issue. Well, not how long can you live, but how are we going to pay for this, as though there's something negative about a long life. So suddenly, one of the architects of Obamacare comes out and writes an article. This was not a hidden videotape.
That would be Dr. Emanuel. Correct?
That was, yes, Ezekiel Emanuel, one of the basically the philosophic architect. He was not just the architect. He's basically embodies what Obamacare espouses, which is supposedly a very fair and reasonable approach to medical care. So he writes an article not just for some blog, but he writes it for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, major magazine read by the elites, read by the intellectuals, And what he said, the name of the article basically was he wants to die at 75. He wants to die at 75. Of course, the hidden message is we all should embrace that. And he talks about people being a burden on society, people, that the healthcare system can't possibly sustain the lives of these people, never asking the question about what is the valuable input of people working at 75 years old.
So he looks at people as a liability.
As a liability,
of an asset.
Absolutely.
Right.
He wouldn't say so, but fortunately, if you look at the comments section after the article on the internet, at least people were not embracing this philosophy. They saw it as essentially dangerous.
Well, you would think too, I mean, it literally goes against the most basic part of a doctor's creed, the Hippocratic Oath, where, the idea is to extend life, to help life. He's basically taking a euthanasia approach where life has no value.
Right, it has no value. I mean, why would someone be valuable at 65 but not at 75? And, who is that to make the decision?
I am curious, when he turns 75, if he's going to have a change in attitude.
Yes, I would. Well,
it'll be interesting to see.
Well, he's 57 now, and I can guarantee you that people don't forget. Nothing disappears on the internet anymore, and people will remember that. And there will be a clock. Someone will be watching him and keeping the Emanuel watch here. One of the responses was very interesting to the article was from a doctor who said he teaches at the Tulane in this School of Medicine, and he's already anticipated this problem. And he said, I've told my medical students, this is my advice to them, is that if you are mandated in some way to offer people the opportunity to leave this world, say a terminally ill person, or a person who may not be terminally ill, but just is suffering from pain. He said, I've told my students that when they become doctors to ignore the law, basically. I mean, and I think what this will encounter, if this is actually promoted, will be a form of civil disobedience, a lot of which we will never hear about, but will occur.
Right, they will not want people to hear that, from the government's point of view.
Right. So it was kind of a frightening, to me, admission by someone who, if he was just a person who, was an ethicist, etc., it would be one thing. But you have to ask yourself, what about this law is engineered in such a way that it, how much of his wish is being fulfilled within the law? And if you remember, people like Palin were attacked because they said they were death panels, except about a year later or 2 years later, the Wall Street Journal ran an article that said, no, they didn't call them death panels, but basically they would be boards, they would be groups of people, regionally established, that would decide whether one should get the treatment that would be required to maintain your existence.
So they get to play God, in effect.
Absolutely. And every time I hear these discussions and these suggestions, I wonder, are they conversant with the breakthroughs that are taking place that can expand our lives and make us live, really almost, I'm not saying we're reaching immortality, but the term superlongevity, which I use, means not just living long, but living healthy. And there are breakthroughs taking place in fields like nanotechnology, bioprinting, which actually developed.
That was fascinating, by the way, in the book. I thought that was absolutely fascinating.
Well,
the bioprinting.
Yes, and I think it's, for those of you who don't, people now know about 3D printing a little more than they did, say, about a year or two ago, which is basically, being able to use a computer and a fabricator to print any object. Well, they're now using living cells to reproduce organs, body organs, ears. They think they might be able to reproduce a pancreas soon. What that means is that we will have readily available body parts of people who need replacement. And what is fascinating about this also, in terms of just the timeline here, this emerged between the publication of my hardcover and the soft cover. You cannot find that in a reference to in the original book. That's how quickly these advances are taking place. So they're occurring exponentially almost. And you wonder why people would be worrying about people living too long. And
But don't you find that that's the way, in effect, because we're talking basically about government. I always found, as you mentioned, great advances in medical, great advances in technology, whether it was the computer revolution, whatever, and yet we're being led in the front by the most archaic, which is our legal system and our government. It's literally having the horse and buggy in front of the Ferrari.
Yes, that's right. And this is why I mentioned that when I talked about the globalization of the medical field in general, I meant it on several different levels, but one of the levels that's really important and very, I think, right now is actually very relevant to our discussion is the field of medical tourism, which basically is stating if you can't get it here, you can get it someplace else.
Right.
If you cannot get a stem cell treatment that is just not offered in the United States, right. If you can't get certain type of dental treatment that's offered here, you can go somewhere else. To me, with all this discussion about looking for ways to reduce medical costs, why are we not talking front and center about medical tourism? I think because a lot of the hospitals and doctors in the United States would prefer that we not discuss it.
The insurance companies, every third-party payer, they all have a vested interest. They may claim not to, but many of them do have that vested interest.
They do, and the fact that you can get certain types of surgeries for 1/5 the price that you could, and these are not, everyone wonders what's the quality of the medical care. There are places in India where you can get, state-of-the-art hip replacements for a much lower rate than you could here. Now, some insurance companies are looking at this seriously. I believe, I'm not sure if it was Aetna or one of them was actually, trying to at least explore the possibility of either informing their clients that they could look elsewhere or giving them certain paybacks in one way or another to reward people for finding cheaper medical care. The problem is we, at this point, are not trained to look at medical services in general. We don't do a lot of we do some doctor shopping, but not a heck of a lot of it. We go to one particular doctor, they send us to a specialist. We're not, at this point...
As long as he's in our network.
Right.
Don't forget that.
Right, and that's the other issue. And and you can imagine at what point will any of these new healthcare laws allow a hospital or a doctor in India to become part of your network? I would suggest never.
Right.
And that's what we actually need to drive down the cost.
Free market.
The absolute the global free market.
Right.
So I think those are all possibilities. And again, it gets back to the attitude issue. Why are we not as a society embracing the concept of long life? I mean, no one wants to die per se, but no one's looking at the positives.
Right.
Of this.
Well, they want as long as they can live as long as they
yes.
desire. If everybody else goes before them, that's okay.
Absolutely.
And one of the other aspects I want to bring up on a positive note was, the other thing I found fascinating was to talk about the robotics. If you want to talk about that, the advances made, when you were talking about, I think it was in Japan, where they have robots now that actually take care of the patients, bedpans, cleaning. I found that, because I couldn't even conceive how that would be possible, yet technology is advancing to where that's actually a reality.
Yes, and these robots are fascinating to watch. As you know, Japan is having lots of problems economically.
Right.
They've moved back into a recession. Part of their problem, talk about population control. They have an aging population, and they do not have a replacement a population cohort at all. So a lot of the service, their quest for the use of robotics in healthcare, care for the aged, care for the elderly, is basically driven by necessity. This is not a dilettante's interest in robotics. They just do not have the personnel to serve as orderlies, as nurses, practical nurses, and in-home companions. So basically, these robots would basically be living in the home. I say living in the home. They would be placed in the home, and they would be able, at this point, to perform some basic, I guess, projects, they would be able to alert the patient they have to take the medication. They would be able to hold the medication for the individual. In worst case scenarios, they could lift the patient off a bed. And they, of course, would be keyed into a security system, so they would have a video component, so that if something happened to the patient, if the patient happened to fall, they could either lift the patient or they could alert someone to it. And this, by the way, has already been explored in a movie called The Robot and Frank, which was
the Robot?
Robot and Frank. It was
Frank.
Frank was an elderly person who was starting in his 80s, starting to suffer from the early stages of dementia. And the family basically offered him a choice, either assisted living, which meant moving out of his home and out of his town, which he loved. He loved the home and the town, or get a companion. Now again, this companion was I call it near future science fiction. It's a science fiction that takes us about 5 to 10 years into the future. So this was basically a very advanced robot. Our robots have not gotten to the point where they can walk with you, talk with you, accompany you through town.
Does it look like, when we think of robots, the metal?
It was made to look humanoid.
Okay.
And it was smaller so that it could seem almost childlike. It was non-threatening. But the interesting aspect of it, and it takes place, of course, the elderly patient, the father, is not interested in having this person, but they start to bond. I hate to say that, yes, they do. And in fact, at points, the robot is programmed to remind the human that I'm not human. You just have to. What was fascinating about this, though, if you stayed through the credits at the end, after seeing this as a kind of interesting humanistic science fiction movie, they run a series of clips of the robots that are existing today, documentary footage of them, and suddenly it's eye-opening for people who stayed for the credits. Everything you thought was science fiction, the future is now. So that aspect of robotics is extremely, it opens up vistas for healthcare and for caring for patients.
Fascinating subject. I'd like to thank you for being here. Again, the book is Ageless Nation, hardcover and paperback. We'd like to thank you once again for being here. And again, absolutely a fascinating read. Thank you, and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.